Welcome to Nomadic Diaries, the Belonging Project. My name is Megan Norton-Newbanks, and I am the co-host. Please meet Doreen Cumberford.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for listening today.
Today, we are talking together about belonging and languages. Doreen, let's begin with you. What language or languages feel most like home to you, and why?
I grew up in Scotland, and of course, in Scotland, we speak English. However, my mother grew up in South Ayrshire, and she spoke Scots, Scots, which is a unique dialect by itself. And that was the language that Rabbie Burns, the poet, wrote in. And so when I hear words from the Scots dialect, I feel the most centered and the most nurtured and the most comfortable. However, and that reminds me, it takes me back to being a child in the house that I grew up in. So that would be my answer. How about yours?
I would say similar. So my mother tongue is English, but as a family unit, my parents, my brother, and I, we moved every 3 years to a different country. And in those moves in those countries, we would pick up conversational words. We would learn the language, the host language. And so in every move, I think our family culture, our family language became this mix up and mashup of all the languages of other host countries we had lived in. And it's still relevant today that, we'll say hello, goodbye, thank you, wait a minute, or hurry up in other languages. So I think family unit language is something that makes me feel at home. But beyond that, the system that I grew up in, what took us to all those countries was the Foreign Service. And I think within the system, there are acronyms or there are ways to talk about
Yes.
transition. And so that makes me feel at home too when I hear the system language or the acronyms being used.
Yes, I remember from living in the Middle East on a compound with a large oil company. I can still remember things like my badge number and a lot of the acronyms because it was absolute and words that were part English, part Arabic, and that still feels like home to me. I don't understand much Arabic anymore, but I did meet a friend recently on the pickleball courts who was also in Saudi Arabia. And so now I address him as Habibi or Habibti, and he addresses me as Habibti because I think it's lovely to carry the languages with us. It's almost like carrying the place and the people with us, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yes. And even now with my husband, we like to teach each other words and languages that we've learned in our childhood. And
Mhm.
so yeah, you'll see I compiled a book called Letters Now Sent. And in the dedication, I actually use two different languages as part of the book. I've dedicated to him. And so that's just something very special and unique to our
Yeah,
relationship.
yeah, that's great. And how has speaking your native language affected your sense of belonging in all these different places that you've lived in? Now you're back in the US now and you're using English in a normal system. But how has that affecting your sense of belonging in the past?
Mm. Yeah, I like this question because it's easy to say it depends or it depended where I was. And I want to draw an experience from international schools that I went to where there was flexibility in the British English U
Oh,
or
yes.
American Standard English without the U. And I thought that was really appropriate and wise of the teachers to not be adamant on one spelling or another, just to create a sense of belonging of we're not highlighting or demanding that there's one spelling that's the right way. So
Sure.
that's one one way I would say that that I appreciated that flexibility with language.
Yes, and I had that dilemma when I was writing Life in the Camel Lane. Was I going to write it in my Scottish language with my Scottish COLOUR and encourage ENCOURAGE and all of the other words? Then there's dozens of them. Um, and I can't remember what decision I made, but in the next one, I'm just mixing it up. And I think I said at the beginning of the in the beginning, you'll notice that some of this language is not consistent. And that's because I am an inconsistent human at this point who crosses cultures.
I love that. Yeah, I love that you gave yourself that freedom because that's who you are and that's code switching naturally for you.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, and that's why also in the book letters, I didn't format the spelling in some way. However, the letters came in from the contributor, that's how it
Yes,
showed up in the book.
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And that makes it more, it's making it more unique, more personal, more culturally rich, because it shows the diversity of people, of the ways of being human. Now, I had someone write to me recently, and he had gone to the podcast and he'd looked at my book and he wrote me a little note and he said, these things just jump out at me. And if you had put the comma here inside the parenthesis instead of wherever it was, and he was just checking all of my grammar or my all of the parts of the writing and there were mistakes. And I said, oh gosh, this is what happens because in the UK we did it a certain way, and in the US we do it a different way. And now I'm totally flummoxed. There's a good word, a good totally flummoxed. And so that's just a fact of life, although I do try to keep everything consistent as best I can. But I really appreciate someone pointing out to me that my use of the English language is so inconsistent now because of the British words that sometimes fall out of my mouth.
Hmm. That's interesting. And maybe then that's not the target audience because maybe the audience who will read the book are people who really celebrate and appreciate that
Right.
you create and shapeshift and you use different grammatical ways of being.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so
Yeah.
what emotions come up for you when you hear your home language, and especially like if you're overseas and you hear it?
Mm. Yeah, I think speaking English has been both a bridge and a barrier. A
I
bridge,
agree.
and clearly it's a lingua franca. There's so many countries in which young people have had to learn it in school, and that's such privilege then as a foreigner coming in and being able to connect in a verbal way with people. But at the same time, it's a barrier because growing up in the different countries, I wanted to practice the host
Yes.
country language. And then I felt people wanted to respond in English. And so there was sometimes a barrier with that. But all in all, I think I would actually flip this question on its head and say, uh, how do I feel when I hear the language of people that I used to grow up with or surrounded by communities, and I really freak out a little bit because I'm like, they are speaking Hungarian or they are speaking Japanese. They're speaking in an accent that I can identify. And so yeah, it's just been very special when the connections with other language speakers come into my circle and I'm able to then reflect back on words I haven't thought about since I was like 8 years old.
Yes, I have the same experience. They are either bridges or barriers. My very best friend here uh, is also from Scotland, and I think that we think similarly. I mean, she speaks fluent Spanish, which I do not yet. However, she really, I think it's the thinking more than the language that we have in common. So my friend who is from Scotland also thinks very similarly. And neuroscientists have also been able to explain over the last 10 or 20 years how our neuro-linguistic programming makes a dent not only in our ears, but also in our brains. And if we cannot articulate something well, then then really it's because we don't have very clear thoughts about it sometimes. And I'm always very interested in the thought process because thought comes before actions. And if we're actually going to be taking the actions to belong, I think it's important to be able to articulate what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good point. Something that comes up for me with what you're saying too is understanding the cultural norms of communication. And in some ways, we need to understand to belong, then to shift, are we going to speak more directly or indirectly with people
Yeah.
around us? And also to pause and not have assumptions if someone is culturally speaking more directly and we're culturally conditioned or shaped by, a different communication way. And so I think to belong, we also need to take into consideration what are the patterns, what's the tone, what are
Yes.
the
Yeah.
norms, so we're not
Yeah.
misunderstanding that nuance.
Yes, definitely. And I did learn when I lived in Arabia, there was a different pace and there was a different pattern when you were with the women and listening to Arabic spoken by women, and Arabic spoken by men was different. And but I could recognize that, and I could understand the pacing, and just although I didn't understand everything they said. In Japan, I only ever spoke enough Japanese to kind of tell me where the station is, please, and what number of bus is that, and and because it was difficult to read the language because it was in pictorial kanji or Chinese characters, and I didn't really didn't I love Japan. I love living there, but the language was so hard. It was taking me a long time to learn it. I loved it. I really enjoyed that language. But I notice now that when I get out, if I'm tired or I come off of a long flight and I get off the flight, something else will come out of my mouth, not Spanish. And my first second language was French. And then my next second language was Arabic. And then my third second language was, I guess, Japanese, although it wasn't very good. And now I'm learning my fourth, which is Spanish. And it's just a mess inside there. And so whatever language, so whatever you can access is what you use. And if you use it in a context, it's the context that is 90% of the communication.
Exactly. So yeah, I think it's also important in this episode that even the nonverbal, what's the nonverbal language that we're feeling, and this really reminds me of Marcia's podcast episode
Yes,
about somatic and the
nomadic
way
language. Yeah.
our whole being communicates.
Mhm.
And I think about too how in some cultures laughing or smiling makes
Mhm.
you like perceived as, wow, strange or something's a little off. And
Right.
yet in America, if you don't smile, you are so unfriendly and not
Yeah.
approachable. So
Yes. Yeah.
think about that too in your language of belonging. How are you showing up in
Yeah.
a space?
Because it's through our patterns of thinking, our patterns of articulation, and our actual physical body patterns of expression. So, well, this has been wonderful. Do you have anything else to say on the subject of belonging and language?
I think that language shapes belonging. And so and not through just national or local tongues, but also through idioms and community specific ways of speaking. And so I think not to be discouraged in when you approach language and belonging that, wow, I have to learn a million vocabulary words, but know that there's so many ways that language shows up in our bodies, in our minds, in our words, and in our actions.
Very true. And I do think I'm just learning that there are 40,000 words that are very similar between Spanish and English, which is very reassuring when you're learning a language. But I think there's another category, and that other category is the untranslatable words. Like in Japanese, there's a word for something like sunlight filtering through the trees. Komaribi, 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 I think. Now, do we have a word in English for sunlight filtering through the trees? No. And
Not
so
one.
it wasn't just learning the equivalent words. It was actually learning the culture and learning. I only knew a few of those words, about 5 of them, but they're very, lots of them are, katsugi and isekai, and all these words are very common now and have been adopted into different ways of using them, particularly in the corporate world. And so a lot of them are very translatable now, but we didn't know that we even needed those words in English.
So true. Absolutely. And even when we think about longing and belonging, there's so many words that we could think about and be translated in other languages that maybe
Yeah,
really pierce that emotion that we're feeling. So
yeah.
yeah, if the listeners have any, we'd love to hear them.
Yes, we'd love to hear your thoughts on belonging in language. And thank you so much for lending your ears and spending some time with us today.
Yes, thank you. Gracias. Merci. Dankeschön.
Yes. And usually on our way out, we say sayonara, masalama, and hasta luego. Thank you.